So just forewarned is forearmed. I am, however, bringing you Peter Baker right now. Last hour, Michael Shear of the New York Times. This hour, Peter Baker of the New York Times. Together, they represent the best in journalism. They're objective. They tell the who, what, where, when, why. You can read Peter's Twitter feed and have no idea what his politics are. Peter, good morning. How are you?
Oh, good morning, Hugh, and congratulations on your anniversaries.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always fun. Now, Peter, this is a tough one today. I talked about this with Michael. I want to talk about it with you. It takes a little bit of a setup, so indulge me a minute or two. The Wall Street Journal, we're talking about President Trump's Mount Rushmore speech. On Monday, the Wall Street Journal opined, quote, at Mount Rushmore, Trump uses 4th of July celebration to stoke a culture war. Quote from the New York Times, Trump uses Mount Rushmore speech to deliver divisive culture war message. From the Associated Press, quote, Trump pushes racial division, flouts virus rules at Rushmore. And from the Washington Post, quote, at Mount Rushmore, Trump exploits social divisions, warns of, quote, left-wing cultural revolution in dark speech ahead of Independence Day. Brit Hume had this to say to Bret Baier about the press coverage in the Mount Rushmore speech on Monday.
Well, the first thing is, Brett, President Trump never mentioned any dead Confederates. His speech, in its bulk, was a ringing, a full-throated defense of America's history and heroes, and there were no Confederates mentioned. It was all the forefathers of our country, Washington, Lincoln, and other great Americans, and that was really the main bulk of it. So what she said is flat out false. And those headlines you mentioned from those newspapers were unbelievably misleading. And some of the other headlines that I saw were even worse than those. In fact, as I followed this over the weekend, I don't think I've ever seen such dishonest and biased coverage of any event. This was a speech meant to be in...
Peter, and I'll just add Holman Jenkins, who's a wonderful objective columnist at the Wall Street Journal, wrote this morning. So here we are. America faces the virus, the protests, the new and dangerous tension with China, and the most tumultuous election in recent memory. And it does so without thought leadership worth the name, with only intellectual and emotional chaos from some of our once credible news organizations. I played the president's entire speech on Monday because I thought it was one of his best of his presidency, along with Saudi Arabia, Poland, Normandy, and the last State of the Union. I just played the whole thing. I thought it was wonderful. What has happened, Peter? Where did this disconnect develop?
Well, we had my colleague Mike Shear on an hour ago, so I'm going to agree with whatever Mike said because I don't want to get off on a disconnect between the two. I'll say this: look, broadly speaking, I didn't cover that particular speech, so I want to be careful about overstating on the coverage of that particular speech. I do think, in general, though, we are at this moment of Rorschach test where people are seeing the same events through obviously different eyes. And, the president is, in fact, of course, playing to this. There is a culture war, and he is playing to that. He's trying to say, look, these people are taking down our history, and it's whether you're talking about the Confederate statues or he's also bringing in, George Washington or Chris Columbus or, even Abraham Lincoln and so forth. And he is talking about, the backlash, or at least trying to stoke a backlash to sort of the protests in the streets and the statues coming down that have been happening in the wake of the George Floyd case. And it's a really interesting and indelible moment where people are seeing through radically different eyes. No question about that.
But all of the eyes that are in the, quote, elite media are seeing the left interpretation of the speech. Tammy Duckworth even invented references to Confederate generals that weren't there. She should have been fact-checked on the spot because it was not. He did not mention. He talked about Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. And he said the radical view of American history is a web of lies. And he said we are the most just and exceptional nation in human history. He did basically 8th grade civics. And every single outlet of the elite media condemned the speech in its news reporting. I don't mind what the opinion writers say. That's our job. I write for the Post in the opinion section. But Peter, has something happened? I had a caller after I had Michael on, and Michael said, it's just reporters trying to give context to the speech. That's why it's dark and divisive. And what happened to who, what, where, when, and why reporting about what he said, who was there, quote the speech, and let people decide? What happened to that, Peter?
Well, look, I think the news industry has changed a lot in the last few decades, not just under Trump, in which who, what, where, when, why formula has evolved. And necessarily, at least for newspapers, which are going to be, by definition, hours behind television, hours behind the internet, especially if you're talking about print newspapers. And we have, over the years, not just because of Trump, tried to do more contextualizing, tried to do more analytical, with our stories. That's not to be the same thing as opinion. And you're right, we shouldn't be traipsing into opinion. I agree entirely on that. But how you define what's opinion and what's analysis is, of course, a murky thing. And people might have differences of opinion about what crosses that line. I think of analysis as being fact-based, as being interpretive, but not good or bad. Good or bad would be opinion. That would be, this is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think that reporters are trying to capture the moment, not necessarily to judge the moment.
When Brit Hume, who is, I think, one of the most respected voices, and he's a creature of the city. He grew up on California Street. He doesn't live there anymore, but he grew up on California Street. And I know Brit. One of the most respected people says it is the most biased coverage of an event he has seen in his career. Does that not sound an alarm in your head, Peter Baker?
I have a lot of respect for Brit. Brit was in the White House when I started showing up there in 1996. When I started on the beat, he was a gracious and terrific competitor. Helped show me around and helped me understand how to cover the beat. So I have nothing but respect for Brit. I don't necessarily agree with him on this. I think that Brit has, over the last few years, been pretty critical of a lot of reporting that we've done and some others, and that's fair. I take it seriously because I do respect him, but I don't always agree with him. I think that sometimes we need to, go beyond the who, what, where, when, why in order to provide context. Otherwise, we're not really serving our readers.
Well, in what way was the president, again, you didn't write the story, but in what way was it a dark speech? It was really an uplifting speech. It was almost torn from any page of any 4th of July speech delivered since Gettysburg, when the long-winded Senator Everett gave his before Lincoln gave his short and memorable speech at Gettysburg.
Yeah, again, I didn't cover the speech, so I don't want to overinterpret what I don't know enough to say. I haven't studied it in order to give you a good answer, so I don't want to be dishonest.
Okay, let me give you a different question then. I think part of the problem, genuinely speaking, you do a lot of television. You always do it well. I always listen to you when you're on. But I think there may be danger for news reporters appearing on cable channels. Not opinion people, but news reporters. I think maybe newspapers ought to ban news reporters from appearing on cable, because the pull of the cable networks is so thoroughly monetized to be political and incendiary now. What do you think?
Well, I think you raise a good point. I mean, it used to be that I would not go on television if I was put on a panel with opinion columnists or people who were advocates one way or the other, because I didn't like the blur of the distinction between a news reporter, which is how I see myself, and pundits, which is a different but also valuable role, right?
Yes.
I don't think we should confuse the two. So I think your point is a fair one, which is that we shouldn't be confusing the two, and we've done too much of that. I wish we didn't do it. I wish I didn't do it in some ways. I can't put the genie back in the bottle. I've given up trying to ask producers only put me on with other reporters, because it just doesn't work that way. They don't operate that way, and I don't control the network. So my view is, when I go on TV or I go on your show, I try to stick to the four corners of what I, as a reporter, feel comfortable doing, no matter what other people on the show might do.
And I appreciate your coming on. That's why I appreciate if you do MSNBC, you do the Hugh Hewitt show. Here's my question. Joseph Pulitzer is honored in those awards because he took the media away from being partisan and returned it to the who, what, where, when, why. Do we need another Pulitzer to do the same thing to the major media in America to recorrect course again?
That's a great historical point, because we forget that, in fact, the media was partisan overtly in the old days. Back when we had 5 newspapers in Washington, you could afford to have a Democratic paper, Republican paper, a liberal, conservative, whatever. And because we consolidated to the point we only have 1 or 2 papers per city, some cities don't even have one. They had to be more mainstream and appeal to people across ideological lines, right? And now, with proliferation of social media and cable and so forth, we've kind of fragmented again, and it's a really interesting moment. And I think you're right to raise it.
Peter Baker, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Follow him on Twitter, Peter Baker NYT, and follow me to